Saltarine Aldyke, who was commonly called Sally, came across a creature that looked like a rabbit lying in the middle of the forest. She wasn't even sure if it was a rabbit since she had never seen a creature like that before. Initially, Sally intended to avoid things she didn't understand. However, as she began to walk away, she heard a loud growling sound from its stomach. Feeling sorry for the creature, she decided to give it a carrot. To initiate a conversation, Sally jokingly asked the creature to consider it a command from a princess, though she also reminded herself that she was no longer a princess. The creature named Fra ate the carrot eagerly. Sally introduced herself and asked if Fra could understand her language. Fra replied that she could understand it a little. Sally then asked for Fra's name, to which she replied, Fra. Curious, Sally asked if Fra was a monster, but Fra explained that she was a demi-human, a rabbit humanoid. This was the moment Sally realized that beings other than humans existed. She also asked why Fra was wearing such strange clothing. Fra explained that it was simply her hobby. Sally pulled out a piece of paper from her bag and asked if Fra had seen the person drawn on it. Fra said she hadn't, but thanked Sally for giving her the carrot. Sally then said her goodbyes, advising Fra not to faint again. However, Fra asked to come along with Sally. Sally, surprised, asked why she wanted to tag along. Fra said it was to repay Sally's kindness. Even though Sally insisted that there was no need for repayment, Fra still decided to follow her. Sally couldn't believe Fra was really trailing her and asked if she had no purpose of her own. Fra admitted she didn't. Sally tried to discourage her, saying it wasn't necessary to accompany her. But Fra argued that traveling alone was dangerous. While Sally agreed, she also remarked that traveling with a demi-human wasn't much different. Hearing this, Fra stopped walking for a moment. Realizing she might have been too harsh, Sally relented and told Fra she could come along. Overjoyed, Fra resumed following Sally. When they arrived at a village, a man approached and asked if Sally was a traveler, mentioning he hadn't seen her before. He greeted her warmly but froze in fear when he noticed Fra screaming that she was a demi-human. It turned out that demi-human were rarely seen in the village. The man demanded that Fra leave as demi-human were not allowed in the area. Sally tried to defend Fra, saying that while she might look unusual, she wasn't evil. The man warned Sally not to be deceived, claiming that demi-human were enemies of humans and couldn't possibly coexist with them. He urged Sally to follow him and leave Fra behind. Sally, reminded of a painful memory of being abandoned, decided to leave with Fra instead. The man shouted after her, begging her not to go, but Sally ignored him. Fra mentioned that the village was actually in the opposite direction. Sally simply instructed Fra to keep following her, declaring it as a direct order. To avoid suspicion, Fra put on a cloak. After observing the area near the village entrance, they made a dash into the village. Once inside, Sally noted that they had successfully sneaked in and only needed to find a place to stay. Suddenly, a man approached them, saying he had never seen them before and asked if they were travelers. Sally explained that they had just arrived. The man, who appeared friendly, said that although the village was simple, they could enjoy their time there. When Fra spotted a basket of carrots the man was carrying, she couldn't contain her excitement and shouted, "Carrots," while pointing at them. Embarrassed, Sally urged Fra to control herself. The man, noticing their apparent hunger, invited them to his house for dinner. He introduced himself as the local leader and assured Sally that it was his duty to welcome travelers, so they didn't need to feel awkward about accepting his offer. The Lord asked where Fra was. Sally explained that Fra seemed exhausted and was resting in the room the Lord had prepared. In reality, Fra was happily munching on a carrot in the room. Sally didn't want Fra to be kicked out again if the Lord found out she was a demi-human. The Lord actually hoped Fra would join him for dinner, but Sally apologized. After dinner, the Lord invited Sally to rest and escorted her to her room. Sally thanked him, and he assured her not to feel shy. Welcoming travelers was something the village could barely manage not long ago due to monsters appearing nearby. Many villagers were killed, and those days were incredibly tough. But one day, a young traveler wiped out all the monsters by himself. Sally asked if the traveler had long black hair, and the Lord confirmed it, wondering if she knew him. Sally was sure that the young traveler who defeated the monsters was Kimbitsu Makoto. She asked where the traveler had gone, but the Lord didn't know. However, he explained that in gratitude for what the traveler did, the villagers had resolved to welcome travelers who passed through the village. Sally understood why the man earlier had tried to drive Fra away. She then asked if travelers who were demi-humans would still be welcomed. The Lord replied that no village would welcome a demi-human, adding that he was intrigued by the term demi-human traveler. The Lord explained that demi-humans were seen as savage and less intelligent from a human perspective, no different from monsters. Thus, demi-humans were considered enemies of humanity. Unbeknownst to them, Fra overheard the conversation about demi-humans. Sally didn't think the Lord was a bad person but felt conflicted. She had promised to stay with Fra no matter what. The next morning, the sound of a monster echoed outside. Villagers screamed that a monster had appeared. Shocked, Sally quickly got out of bed and ran outside to see. The villagers were terrified, realizing that a monster had survived after the young traveler's earlier efforts. But this wasn't just any monster, it was an Oni. The villagers murmured that they might be able to handle it if there were only one. Sally approached the creature and recognized it as an Oni. Suddenly, her body grew hot and her heart pounded fiercely. She had felt this before. The Lord urged her to step back, but she was frozen in place. Just then, Fra darted toward the monster that was about to attack Sally. She kicked it, sending it crashing to the ground in a single blow. Fra then stomped on the monster until it was dead. Sally thanked Fra for saving her. The villagers, however, were terrified of the demi-human who had killed a monster bare-handed. Sally tried to explain that Fra had protected the village, but because she was a demi-human, the villagers still despised her. The Lord admitted that the ferocity needed for a demi-human to kill an Oni was frightening. He decided to drive them out of the village. Unexpectedly, Fra approached the Lord, smiled, and thanked him for the delicious carrots. Sally urged Fra to leave with her, and Fra followed. One of the villagers asked the Lord if he was sure about letting the demi-human go, fearing she might return to attack them. The Lord, however, seemed moved by Fra's gratitude. Sally wished the village could change even a little. Suddenly, members of the Riverside Knights surrounded Sally and Fra. Their commander wanted to ask them some questions. They were forcibly taken to the Northern Empire's Riverside Kingdom Palace. The two were placed in a prison cell, their hands shackled. Sally couldn't understand how things had escalated like this. The Riverside commander apologized for the excessive cell and shackles, explaining that it was necessary because the situation involved a demi-human. Sally was frustrated. Once again, it was all because of the demi-human issue. The Riverside Knights commander apologized for making Sally and Frau uncomfortable. He unlocked the cell and removed their shackles. The commander introduced himself as Greater Hawthorne. Sally introduced herself and Frau in return. Hawthorne asked if Sally was still mad at him. Sally replied that of course she was. She was arrested simply because Frau was a demi-human, and for being with a demi-human. Hawthorne admitted that was partly true, but clarified that the reason they were detained and shackled was that Frau was a powerful demi-human who could take down an Oni with her bare hands. Sally asked if Hawthorne had actually seen Frau defeat the Oni. Hawthorne nodded, explaining that he witnessed it on the road. He hadn't believed a demi-human could fight an Oni, let alone kill one with such ease. Sally was confused as to why everyone viewed demi-humans as monsters. Hawthorne admitted that he used to think that way too, but his perspective changed after he saw Frau fighting to protect Sally and bowing respectfully to someone important in the village. In his eyes, fighting to protect others was the true spirit of a knight. He offered Frau a fist bump. Frau smiled and bumped fists with him, and Sally was happy that someone finally recognized Frau's goodness. Hawthorne then invited them to leave the prison. Sally was surprised at how easily they were being released. Hawthorne explained that it had been an unjust detention of two innocent travelers, and he acknowledged the mistake made by his side. He assured them they didn't need to worry as he would take full responsibility for the matter. Suddenly, Frau's stomach growled, and she mentioned that she was hungry. Hawthorne chuckled, saying she must be hungry after feeling relieved. Sally, however, expressed her dissatisfaction, pointing out how poorly they had been treated. She emphasized that even though they were innocent travelers, they had been detained unfairly and interrogated without food or water. Hawthorne thought Sally was exaggerating. Sally refused to drop the matter unless Hawthorne treated them to a meal. Hawthorne was shocked at her demands, reluctantly agreeing to provide lunch but warning them not to expect free dinner because knights didn't earn much. While walking through the market, a seafood vendor offered Hawthorne a fresh octopus they had just caught. Sally, upon seeing the octopus, was reminded of the terrifying image of being entangled by a giant one. Hawthorne declined the offer, explaining that he wasn't alone. Two young boys approached Hawthorne, asking what he was doing at the market. They teasingly asked if Sally was his girlfriend and made comments about Sally's impressive figure. Embarrassed, Sally quickly clarified that she wasn't Hawthorne's girlfriend and that he wasn't even close to her type. Meanwhile, Frau wandered over to a carrot vendor. Sally called out to Hawthorne, asking him to pay for the carrots Frau had picked. At the Riverside Kingdom's castle, two powerful Oni stood before its gates: Meki, a high ogre from the east, and Set, a dog Oni from the north. Set confidently declared he could destroy the old castle by himself, but Meki reminded him that Kishin had paired them up to demolish the Riverside Kingdom together. Without further ado, they began their assault. A loud explosion suddenly shook the castle as the front section was obliterated. Meki had used Kihu to tear down the castle's entrance. However, using Kihu caused her body to shrink, and Set laughed at her shrunken form. Meki assured him she would return to normal soon and ordered him to attack first. The Riverside Knights rushed to intercept the threat, recognizing Set as no ordinary monster but an Oni. Determined, they vowed not to let him enter the castle. Set quickly tore through the knights one by one, his strength overwhelming. He mocked the knights, telling them not to prattle on when facing an enemy. After Set decimated the knights, Sally suddenly appeared before him. She seemed entranced, as if hypnotized every time she saw an Oni. Set, noticing her strange gaze, paused in confusion. Hawthorne called out to Sally, urging her to run, but she didn't seem to hear him. Suddenly, Frau leaped forward and kicked Set in the face, though the attack had no effect. Set was surprised to see a demi-human there. Hawthorne was baffled by how unaffected Set was by Frau's kick. Frau's shout snapped Sally out of her trance. Relieved, Hawthorne urged Sally to get away, but instead, Sally suggested Frau join her in fleeing. Hawthorne grabbed Sally and escorted her to safety. Set was surprised to encounter a demi-human protecting humans. Frau explained she was repaying Sally for her kindness and giving her carrots. Moreover, Sally wasn't afraid of her, which made Frau want to stay by her side. Amused, Set declared that Frau's loyalty made their battle more intriguing. After introducing themselves, they engaged in combat. Hawthorne, meanwhile, focused on evacuating the townspeople, prioritizing their safety over confronting the Oni. Realizing Sally wasn't with him, he began searching for her. Frau struck Set with her hammer, but the blow had no effect. Set acknowledged her speed but mocked her lack of power. When Set counterattacked, Frau dodged skillfully but was ultimately caught. Set offered Frau a choice: abandon humanity and live or die protecting them. Frau lifted her hammer, declaring she would protect Sally and never run away. Set prepared to finish her, tossing her aside and promising to kill her with his full strength. Defeated and resigned, Frau whispered her farewell to Sally. Just as Set was about to strike, Sally appeared, shouting that Frau couldn't lose. Frau regained her resolve and attacked again but was overpowered. As she fell injured, Sally rushed to her side. Set, now fully aware of Sally's importance to Frau, decided to kill them both. Frau urged Sally to escape, but a strange sensation took hold of Sally. Her heart pounded and her body grew warm. A legendary tale of Momotaro came to her mind. A peach that brought forth a hero who defeated Onus. Sally pondered the possibility of there being more than one peach. Suddenly, Sally smiled eerily, her aura becoming menacing. When Set moved to attack, Sally's hand instinctively drew her sword and severed Set's wrist in one swift motion. Stunned, Set couldn't believe how easily she had injured him. In an unsettling trance, Sally laughed triumphantly, delighted at her newfound ability to defeat Set.